Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. I'm joined today by my friend Dr. Michael O'Connor, Associate Professor of Music at Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida. We discuss the life and composition of the lesser-known composer Juan de Esquivel, who not only has some interesting music you should get to know, but whose life presents a sort of snapshot of the effect of the Council of Trent on composers at that time, as well as some of the theological dialogue surrounding the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception at that time. First, a quick note about two classes we're offering this summer at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music that touch on this topic. The first is History and Principles of Sacred Music, which is a self-paced course week by week for 9 weeks online starting May 30th and concluding with 2 days online together synchronously on July 31st and August 1st. We study and search the history of sacred music for the principles which emerge from it that shape the Church's mind about her sacred music, as well as church documents and legislation about sacred music and practical issues that are shaped by this understanding in parish and school music programs. The other is the Choral Institute, July 17th through 21st, which is entirely in person at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California. It's a 20-voice auditioned group that will sing polyphonic motets and ordinaries, developing skills for singing this music in the liturgy, as well as teaching it to others in parish music programs. This summer, 2023, offers free tuition for these and all of our 12 graduate-level courses. The application is available on our website, catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org, and room and board is also available on campus during the in-person courses for an affordable rate. catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org, check it out. And now on to the interview. Mike, it's so great to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining me.
Jenny, it's my pleasure. Exactly. I mean, it's been so long since I've seen you, and I'm so glad to see that you're doing so well now, way out in California. But it's great to talk to you again.
Yes, formerly a neighbor, but now neighbor by technology. So thanks for being here. So our topic today is the impact of the Council of Trent, namely through the post-conciliar publication of the 1570 Missale Romanum on composers generally, but focusing especially on the work of a particular composer with whom you've spent a lot of time, namely Juan de Esquivel Barahona. He's a bit of an obscure composer, and so it seems best if we start with his biography. And can you sketch out some of the main details for us, important dates, where he worked, that sort of stuff?
Sure. Yeah, Esquivel's an interesting guy. I mean, I seem to be drawn to these more interesting composers that have sort of, cool stories. In his case, we don't know when he was born, but we do know that he was born in a city by the name of Ciudad Rodrigo. It's about, half an hour, 40-minute drive, just a little bit southwest of Salamanca in Spain. Which is hugely important, right? Because of the impact of Salamanca. It's just a sort of intellectual shadow there. Yeah, with a big university there. And of course, it had the only real Spanish publisher there, too, for music. And I'm sure we'll get into that in a moment. But yeah, we know he was born in Ciudad Rodrigo because he calls that his hometown in a later document. And he's actually called Civitatensis in one of his publications, which was the shorthand in Latin for being from Ciudad Rodrigo. One of the problems with Esquivel is that we don't have much documentation in that city for him because it was a city that was on the road from Portugal into the center of Spain. And so both the British and the French came through there, and they destroyed quite a bit during the Napoleonic Wars, the Wars of Spanish Succession, all of that sort of thing. Fortunately, we do have one piece of evidence from the Actas Capitulares that states that Esquivel was taken in as a choir boy in, I want to say 1568. So we kind of say about 1560, maybe about the time he was born. From there, we don't know a whole lot. We know he probably had some interaction with a composer by the name of Juan Navarro, who was actually working at Ciudad Rodrigo in those days. He was another composer who was from Avila, just like Victoria was. And he's another composer that's not well known, but his music's really, really nice. So he may have had some study time with Navarro. His the next thing we know about him, his first job is in Oviedo, up in the north part of Spain, in Asturias. We don't know if he spent any time in Madrid at university or not. He seems to be an educated person. So during that gap, he got some musical and, sort of liberal arts education as well, I believe. So he gets the job in Oviedo in 1581, if memory serves, and not without a little controversy. He got the job because some of the canons of the cathedral were away at the time. And so the rest of them did the audition and he got it. He was named. The rest of them came back and said, no, you can't do that. We've already, recruited this guy from Leon to come up and do this. And so there was actually a very, very long court battle in which a lot of the documents survived down in Leon. And they're just fascinating to read about, this person, did this and this person was not supposed to do this, but this person has a higher rank and all those sorts of things. But anyway, so he ends up getting the job. And he's a young man. He's very ambitious about the types of music he wants to present for the various festivals, but he gets into a little bit of trouble financially, overspending his budget, actually going broke along with another fellow there at the cathedral. And then at some point in 1585, there's a note in the Actas Capitulares that said, "We don't know where Esquivel is. We don't know where he went." And so in the dark of night, he and this other guy apparently, just fled because they owed so much money. Within about a month, we find him in a little city by the name of Carajora over in the La Rioja region of Spain, which is over just a little bit north of Aragon near the Basque region. And it's where all the great wine comes from in Spain. And so he's at this little city. And we read in the Actas Capitulares there all this really great information about the test that he had to get the job as the choir master there. And apparently he passes it with great ability and beats out several other people who are local. And so he has that job for a while. And then the same thing happens. There's a note in the Actas Capitulares that says, well, where is Esquivel? We have no idea where he is. And later on, I was the one who actually found this document at the cathedral there, saying that one of the canons, writing to the cathedral chapter saying, I've just received this letter from Esquivel. Apparently he's taken a job in his hometown of Ciudad Rodrigo, about 1591. And so that's where he stays. He even got an offer.
Wow.
He got an offer for the position in Burgos, very prestigious position. But he said, no, I like it here. This is my hometown. I want to stay here. And so while he was there, he apparently befriended the local bishop there, because the bishop, who came from a notable civilian family, underwrote 3 big books of polyphony, making Esquivel one of the most published composers in all of Spain. And so, we have a lot of music from him, but it's still not so well known today. Although more and more we start to hear, people doing some of the pieces, because some of the things I've put up on, like CPDL and of course Mappa Mundi has published quite a bit of Esquivel's music. But there he stayed, and one of his friends, who was known as a choir chaplain, wrote a history of Ciudad Rodrigo, and in that history he talks about Esquivel a bit. So that's the only information we have about him in the city. But he also mentions that there were 2 more books that he published. Right about 1623. One of them is a book of music for the instrumentalists of the cathedral, the ministriles. And another one was another book of sacred music, in which he says was very interesting music. So apparently Esquivel was really kind of pushing some boundaries there. Unfortunately, we don't know where those 2 books are. A friend of mine recently told me he's found a reference to one of them, but still no existing copies. So we don't know when he died or where he's buried or anything like that, because again, the records at the cathedral are mostly gone.
Wow. That is a very interesting story, and sounds like a good treasure hunt.
Oh, it was a lot of fun. It was a great deal of fun. I did that during my Fulbright year in 1998-99, just sort of tracking this guy down across Spain.
Wow, that's great. So what are some ways in which you would characterize Esquivel's music? How does he sound, for example, in comparison to, say, more well-known composers that we know, like Guerrero or Victoria? And if you were listening and you hear something, it's Esquivel, like, are there some kind of fingerprints that you can identify?
you would have to listen to an awful lot of Spanish polyphony to be able to tell, I think, any of these composers, by their sort of trademarks, because a lot of them are often very subtle. Now, with the composers that went off to Rome, like Morales and Victoria, they're easy to hear because they're doing a lot of things which, the Italians are doing. And so you hear some of that in their music. And of course, they're setting texts that Italians set and that sort of thing. Essentially, all these younger composers were disciples of Guerrero. And so we hear a lot of that sound in the music of Esquivel and people like Vivanco and people like Lobo and that sort of thing. And that sound is, oh gosh, hard to say. It doesn't have the really nice melodic sounds that we get from Morales or Victoria. I don't know, maybe it's just being in Italy that gives you that sense of, these very, very sort of, pretty soprano parts that, sort of give the sweetness to Italian sounds. Again, it's really, really hard to describe. Esquivel was very much a disciple of Guerrero. He actually set a couple of Guerrero's motets, or used his motets for parody masses. He even copied one of Guerrero's motets, the approach to it. We all know Guerrero's Ave Virgo Sanctissima. It's like his most famous motet. And so what Esquivel does is he writes his own motet with a different text that does the same thing. It has the two sopranos in canon on the top, and then the rest of it in counterpoint. And he actually makes a couple of little, aural nods to Guerrero in that as well. It's a very, very, nice little dedication to someone he's very influenced by. I would love to know if he actually ever met the man, but we can't know that. It's just, the evidence is not there.
How would he have encountered Guerrero's music? I mean, Guerrero was just so widely published that every composer writing or working would have an encounter with it?
Yes, one of the things that, of course, I look at, in my research is when I go to a cathedral that Esquivel worked at, I see, okay, what is the inventory of the choir books that they have during the time he was there? So he was very, very familiar with Morales, because everybody had Morales's works in Spain. He was very familiar to some degree with Victoria, but Victoria is only slightly older than Esquivel. So a lot of his music comes in a bit later. But definitely Morales and definitely Guerrero. I mean, everybody had those books in their inventories while Esquivel was there. So, he's actually conducting their music, for his choirs. So he gets to know that, that music very, very well.
Yeah. So can you describe, we're shifting the conversation now to this topic about the 1570 Roman Missal. Can you describe by the process by which the 1570 Roman Missal was adopted in Spain? Maybe our listeners are more familiar with that process elsewhere in Europe, that it was voted on by cathedral canons. But of course, Spain has some longer liturgical history that played into the quo primum mandate.
Right. Spain has a very interesting association with the proceedings of the Council of Trent. They had probably one of the largest foreign delegations there. Philip II had some very, very important people sort of helping to drive those discussions as well. And because, that Spain was one of the biggest Catholic countries, what they wanted had some influence, in the proceedings of the council. So Philip II is of two minds, really. He's very, very interested in the reforms because he sees the universal liturgy as a way of uniting his kingdom religiously. Because, within Spain, you have Cathedral Seville, very long tradition of their own texts and chants. You have Toledo, of course, which goes all the way back, and they still have the chapel with the Mozarabic, chants and that thing. Of course, Barcelona, and then Portugal, which was actually part of Spain in those days. So you have a lot of these different traditions, and they're very, very closely held. So Philip would like to see all these sort of brought together into a single unified liturgy. But on the other hand, he also wants to have protection for some of these very, very old practices. Again, like the Mozarabic chapel in Toledo, that was kept and allowed to keep going, with that liturgy. But also, he made sure that when the texts were brought in for the new Roman Rite, that there wasn't a stipulation that the chants also had to change. So for a while, the Spanish
do you mean changing the melodies or
the melodies?
The text?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what happens is, the new texts come in, and for all those texts that the Spanish were already singing, they kept their melodies, maybe made a few little adjustments here and there to, get the Roman curial versions. But then for those texts which they didn't sing, they had to come up with either use the Roman chant or compose one of their own. Mostly they just decided, we'll just use the Roman chant. And I'd say within a generation or two after Esquivel, we start to see the Roman chant sort of taking over, because everybody's basically encouraged to get even closer and closer and closer to the ideal of Trent.
And do you mean by that, I mean, of course, there are all this flourishing of post-Tridentine chant versions. I mean, like what version are you talking about here? Like, was there a particular publisher that was favored, these Palestrina so-called editions of the chant, or what are you talking about there?
I'll have to confess, that's not part of the research I was looking into. I looked at the chants that were published, not long after the Missal and Breviary comes out. And so if that's the Palestrina versions, I guess that's what I was looking at. But I compare those to what the Spanish were singing about, maybe 10 years later. And those are the ones that I make the comparisons against to see, how close are they to the Roman chant? Are they using the Roman chant, or are they using one of their own?
Let's look at a sort of case study. In one of your articles, you discuss two requiems that Esquivel composed, one in 1608 and the other not long after in 1613. So can you describe some of the ways in which Esquivel fits the typical Spanish model for composing a polyphonic requiem, and how he strives to adapt to the new 1570 Missal, more so in that later 1613 requiem?
Sure. He follows the Spanish practice of, and I think in Italy, a few of the cathedrals do this as well, is that you take the Requiem chants, and the Requiem was one of those few Mass settings, kind of like the Saturday Marian Mass, in which you definitely use the chants in your Mass settings. So he would take the chants, put them in fairly long note values, very clearly in the top line, the cantus, and make that very, very clear. And then, of course, build his polyphony around that. And this is a very old tradition in Spain. So I'm not exactly sure where. I don't think anybody really knows where that originates, whether it's up in the north or not. But it's something that we see in Spain, and to some degree in Italy as well. He uses also the traditional Spanish melodies, for those chants. So to what degree that gives it a different sound, it gives it that very much traditional Spanish sound. Again, with those texts that that he doesn't have a melody for, like the Dies Irae, that was almost never sung in Spain, up until the change of the Requiem. So he has to use the Roman one, but he also doesn't set the entire thing. He only uses the last chunk of it, I think, from the Pie Jesu on out. So in fact, I think he's the only composer that I know in all of Spain who even sets any of the Dies Irae at all polyphonically for the Requiem Mass. And as far as the later version goes, the big difference we see is in the 1608 version, it's a little bit more on the traditional side of things. But as we get into the 1613 version, he gets it a little bit, he makes it shorter for the most part, I think, is the big thing I notice. And this is a tendency of Esquivel. As he gets into his later publications, his music becomes much, much more concise and much, much more clear in what it's trying to do, especially as far as being in relation to the various days of the liturgical year. But I remember Robert Snow talks about Esquivel as a miniaturist, and I think he's pretty close to right on that. Although not all of his pieces are small. I mean, his Magnificats are actually quite ample, but in his motets, in his Mass settings, we just see he likes to get to the point. That's the best way I can say it, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. And if I'm remembering correctly from your article, you mentioned something about how, the typical Spanish practice also was to set the gradual, but Esquivel sets in both of those the tract rather than the gradual, right?
Right. And most of the Spanish requiems that precede his work, the gradual seems to be sort of the preference for polyphonic setting, but he turns now to setting the tract. I'm not exactly sure why that is, other than the fact he sees other composers, outside of Spain doing this. And I think he wants to, sort of follow that practice. Perhaps he sees, that's the way things are going to be going.
Another of the changes for the Spanish composers, and of course all composers, was the adoption of the Roman breviary of 1568.
Mm-hmm.
So in your work, you note the composition of a number of hymn collections by Spanish composers in response to that publication. And of course, 1568 is obviously a little early in Esquivel's life. So he's later on this spectrum, but he comes in with his own collection in 1613. So could you describe some of the changes that were brought about by the adoption of the new breviary for Spaniards like Esquivel?
I've always seen Esquivel as a bit of an opportunist. He comes along, he's one of the generation that grows up essentially with the new Reformed Rite. I mean, as a child, of course, he learns the old rite, but as he's growing up and becoming a professional in the church music world, he has to work in this new rite. And he notices that of all the Spanish composers who have published music for both the Mass and the office, that, it's for the old system. And so he sees, hey, there is a huge opportunity here. If I can get my music out there, that conforms to all these new, the new breviary and the new missal, then I have an opportunity to sell a lot of books. Now, I'm sure he has a very, very spiritual component to this. I don't doubt that at all. He seems to be, very, very dedicated to, his faith and his art, for everything that I can tell. The type of book that he publishes in 1613 is basically a kitchen sink book. It has everything. It has masses, magnificats, hymns, psalms, has a setting of the Benedictus. It really has everything. And so
wow.
I say all this just to get around to the fact that the hymns he publishes, he chooses very, very carefully the ones he knows that are not already published by other composers to fill those gaps.
Wow.
So again, that's why I kind of see this as a little bit of an entrepreneur, sort of approach.
Yeah. Would this have been one of the books that you mentioned that was supported by the local bishop there?
Yes, all of them were. I mean, Esquivel, of course, would not have had the kind of money to, to front the printing money for this. But
right.
From everything I've been able to find is that many of the cathedrals in Spain bought his books.
Yeah. And so interesting too, you're mentioning kind of like filling the holes of left by other composers, but it's interesting that no one undertook a complete project of this, that there's no one composer that you can look to and do his hymns for the entire breviary. I mean, it's obviously a huge project, but yeah, it's interesting how Esquivel is filling that in.
Well, one of the reasons for that too is that the musical groups in these cathedrals had to make decisions about, what were we going to sing polyphonically at the office? Because guess what? We also have to do Mass today. And we also have to do, maybe lauds as well. And so some of the liturgical days probably just didn't have a tradition of singing a polyphonic hymn. And so this is something that he probably knew, or he probably just said, okay, there's a lot of hymns right there. I'll write more later.
Yeah. Let's tap into a little bit of what you were talking about Esquivel's kind of perspective and his spiritual outlook, which is notable. And you draw this out really well in your work. So you note that he has a sort of desire for quote unquote orthodoxy and alignment with the reforms of the Council of Trent, that he was really kind of on board with this program. And so how did he balance out those reforms with the Spanish traditions handed on to him to present a sort of organic growth in sacred music? Because you've been drawing this out a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could give us some more examples about how he really was keeping up with the tradition that he was handed on to, but he also responded to these reforms.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that drew me to him, other than the fact that, very little was known about him. And that was a great opportunity, to do some research, especially as a doctoral student. But one of the things I found as I was looking at Esquivel is that he has been handed this really, really wonderful tradition of doing things in a certain way polyphonically in Spain by, people like Morales while he's actually working in Spain. So a lot of these traditions, and he understands that his singers and his congregation of clergy also expect things to be done in a certain way. And so he comes up with some great ways of keeping as much of that as possible, while yet still bringing in the reforms of the texts from Trent, of the things that are sung. And when there is a chant that needs to be adjusted, for example, in a cantus firmus, he makes very, very minimal adjustments to accommodate any new words or changes of words that may come into those texts. So you can just see him when you're looking at the music and comparing it to what Spaniards had done before and what the new Roman Rite is asking for. You can see him really balancing those ideas.
So a particularly interesting article you wrote chronicles the debates surrounding the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception before it was infallibly defined in 1854. So perhaps our listeners are familiar with the debates pitting the Franciscans and the Jesuits on the side of Mary being free, not only from personal sin, but also preserved from the first moment of her conception from original sin, against the Dominicans who thought she had been purified in the womb, similar to the tradition surrounding John the Baptist. Could you tell us a little bit about how this controversy played out in the musical sphere, especially in Spain, where many sided with the Franciscans and Jesuits? And what do you see in Esquivel's work representing this debate?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic. I'll just go ahead and give away the answer at the beginning. I think Esquivel would have sided with what was called the more pious option, which was what eventually became the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. But one of the issues that he had is that the guy who was paying for all of his music was a Dominican. And as you said, the Dominicans, they had an issue with the Immaculate Conception. And any of your listeners who've studied this, how they probably know the story. They took a look at scripture, they took a look at the writings of the church fathers, and they just couldn't see any real support for it. For Mary being free of original sin, even before time began, I think is the way it goes. But the Dominicans kind of saw that and said, hey, this kind of gives her a bit of an out, because we look at her as the model Christian, and if she was free from original sin, then how do we use her as this example that we keep placing her as? And so they had some real serious reservations about that. The Franciscans, who of course we all know, they're the ones like closest to the people, and so they're the ones who are saying, but the people really like this, they really want this. And the Jesuits, as we know, they say, well, okay, well, theology might say this, but we want this. And that's kind of the way things go. And so what happened is that these two orders especially start kind of battling it out, especially right around the time of the Council of Trent. The council fathers were very wise not to bring this up during the council. They said, listen, we'll talk about this another day. Pius V actually said, will you all please stop excommunicating each other over this? And so, for a while there was peace, but it kind of got brought up again. And now musically, how it played out was composers began writing polyphony on texts that were very closely associated with the Immaculate Conception. And of course, those symbols mostly come from the Song of Songs, okay, and from the iconography. So there's a lot of things like, the precious pearl, the gate, all of that sort of things that you see in all the paintings, about the Immaculate Conception. Those texts are then drawn into motets, especially. And so when you see that imagery showing up, especially in like music of Guerrero, he was at Seville, and Seville was very, very, for the Immaculate Conception. When you see those texts, then you start saying, okay, well, this is obviously sort of a pro-Immaculata sort of, motet. Esquivel probably would have written one of those, except for he had to be kind of careful. He didn't want to offend his bishop, who was a Dominican. And so what he does is he writes a motet that is very similar, like I mentioned earlier before, to Guerrero's most famous Immaculate motet, Ave Virgo Sanctissima. But he uses a text that is very milquetoast about Mary's own conception. It's basically just a devotional text to Mary. And so he kind of on one side says, hey, everybody knows this motet by Guerrero, so make sure you hear that subtext in this one when you listen to this one.
Interesting.
But that's what I found with Esquivel. I just found that fascinating. I may be reading way too much into that, but I don't think so.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting balancing act. And, of course, any working composer or church musician understands that very well. And it's a really fascinating period in history too, just because having this perspective now of the defined dogma, seeing how that played out is also so interesting to look back.
Yeah, it was amazing that, during that time, it was such a heated debate. And then time passed, And the old saying is, in the middle of the 19th century, when no one was paying attention, they declared a dogma.
Yeah, amazing. So I'd like to actually finish, if we could, with some practical bits. What do you see in the work of Esquivel that makes him particularly attractive to our colleagues who direct choirs? And what makes his work approachable now?
Well, I'll preface this by saying that polyphony is hard, and we know that. And so anyone doing polyphony with their church choirs or scholae, I mean, you have to have a very, very good group just to even do the simplest things. It just really takes a lot of experience to do it well. And with Esquivel, there are some pieces I can recommend for groups who fall into that category, especially for funerals. His In Paradisum for six voices is absolutely stunning. It's one of his most beautiful works. And of course, it's situated in a portion of the Requiem Mass in which I think beauty is very well placed, right at the end, as the casket is being taken out of the church. It's when that's sung. I like that one. I recommend that one. And if you're doing concerts, please program that one because it's just gorgeous. His music, however, for the most part, falls into that category of well-crafted. And during the Renaissance, calling a composer's music well-crafted was the highest praise. This idea of writing, sort of this very sensual music was really not the highest order. However, certain pieces like, Guerrero's Ave Virgo Sanctissima or Palestrina's music or some of Lasso's pieces or even Guerrero. I was at a concert at the end of a conference I was at last week in which they sang a number of Spanish composers. But whenever they sang Guerrero, we all just looked at each other and go, that's why he's the best. Because, he just stood head and shoulders above everybody else's music. But as far as Esquivel goes, I can recommend his 1613 Requiem Mass. I mean, it's a very, very nice. It's not long, so it's one that can be used, today without, taxing anybody's patience.
Is there an edition of that up on CPDL?
I don't believe the entire mass is up on CPDL, but you can get it through a company called Mappa Mundi. It's published in England. They've done a lot of Esquivel's things.
Great.
Also, his Missa Ave Virgo Sanctissima, based on Guerrero's motet, which was the first time that was performed in modern times, was at my wedding.
Aww.
Yeah, I transcribed it out, and some friends of mine sang that, and eventually was later published by Mappa Mundi. I'm trying to think of some other things that I really like by Esquivel. There's a few recordings out there, like his there's an Advent motet, Veni Noli Tarare, I think is the one. That's very, very nice. One of his biggest pieces that he wrote was an 8-part, two choir setting of Sancta Maria Succurri Miseris. I think it's one of his earlier pieces too, because it doesn't have some of those things that we see from his later music, the conciseness and stuff. Yeah. This one is, you can tell he probably, maybe had, some help from, say, somebody like Juan Navarro, because there's actually some things in that piece that I see in Navarro's music as well. So it might be a very, very early piece by him.
Do you happen to know where that text is from?
That text actually comes from, it's assigned to the Feast of the Nativity of Mary, 8th of September. And it's an antiphon to the Magnificat of First Vespers for the Feast of the Snows, the August feast. Yeah.
Wow, that's great. Wonderful. Are there some recordings that you really like of Esquivel that you'd recommend?
So yeah, there's a couple I can recommend sort of offhand. One is by a group called the Ora Singers, the ORA Singers. It's called A Song of Songs Collection. It's on Harmonium Mundi. Okay. And they've recorded Esquivel's Surge Propera Amica Mea from the Song of Songs, which is a very nice one. Another one is from the ensemble Corund, Corund. They recorded Esquivel's Tria Sunt Munera, a little Christmas motet. And that's on the Naxos label, I believe. It's called Christmas Spanish Music from the Renaissance. And occasionally you find his music, again, like one-offs on recordings and some of the bigger groups. I don't think like Taos Scholars have done them yet. I remember Richard Cheatham with the Orchestra of the Renaissance did a recording of Spanish music in which there was an instrumental version of one of Esquivel's pieces. But needless to say, there needs to be quite a bit more.
Yes. Good invitation to finish off this interesting interview. This has really been great, Mike. And thanks for sharing your insights, particularly with this liturgical impact of Trent and the life of Esquivel. It's so interesting. So I hope our listeners check out the work of Esquivel, and hopefully we'll keep contributing to this body of knowledge and recordings.
Right. If you'd like to read up more on Esquivel, if you happen to be on the academia.edu, you can look up my name, and almost all my articles are published there. You can also go to Facebook, in which Juan de Esquivel, I actually have a page there. And when I find good recordings, I post them there. You can see the one and only picture of Esquivel. It's a woodcut from one of his publications.
Yeah, that's so great. Thanks so much for this, Mike.
My pleasure, Jenny. And of course, it was just great talking to you again. I wish you all the best with your new thing out in California, and best of luck with this series. It's great.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time. And until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.